Femi Oke.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, can exposing China's internment camps close them? After journalists reveal classified documents on Muslim internment camps, China pushes back with its own narrative.
We'll speak to a panel of journalists covering Xinjiang, and we want your input. Send us your questions and your comments via Twitter or our live YouTube chat.
Hi, this is Farida Deef, the Canada Director of Human Rights Watch, and you are in the stream.
China says Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities who have been detained in the so-called re-education camps have been released.
At present, all the trainees who participated in the training courses on learning Mandarin, law, skills and de-radicalisation have completed their studies. They've achieved stable employment with the help of the government, improved their quality of life and now live a happy life.
China's narrative runs contrary to assessments from the UN and human rights groups who say that more than 1 million people have been held in mass detention camps designed to suppress Muslim identity and build loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing insists that they are programs intended to combat what it sees as religious extremism. The recent media offensive follows investigative reporting from the New York Times, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and others that published reports last month based on leaked documents from the Chinese government.
So today we'll hear from a panel of journalists who cover Xinjiang. Joining us on set is Mamatjan Juma, Deputy Director of Radio Free Asia's Uyghur Service, and Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, China reporter with Axios. She was the lead for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cables project, which helped reveal the inner workings of mass internment camps in Xinjiang. And in Tel Aviv, Megha Rajagopalan, an international correspondent for BuzzFeed News. She was formerly China bureau chief for BuzzFeed and was the first journalist to find and visit an internment camp for Uyghur Muslims. Welcome everyone to the stream. I want to start with our community because here on the stream, we've covered the Uyghurs and what's going on in this region of China for a while now, and still there's some confusion. So I want to read two tweets to you. This first is from Bala, who says, "My question is, why is the Chinese government calling it training camps and the world are calling them concentration camps?" Another person writes in, this is Betty, and she says, "Re-education is a misleading term. These are concentration camps where every moment is monitored and punishments are harsh and frequently administered." So, Megha, I will give this one to you because, of course, as we mentioned at the top of the show, the Chinese government is now saying people have been released from these camps. You've actually been to one. What can you tell us about what they are and what calling them accurately, what that looks like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The whole term, the term re-education certainly comes from Communist Party dogma, and it's been used not only in China, but in also in places like the Soviet Union and in 1930s Germany, for instance. Basically signifying that people are being taken to a facility where their patterns of thought or their kind of ideals or beliefs are going to be shifted fundamentally in some way. I think what's notable about some of the document leaks that we've seen this past month is that it's become very clear that the party, even in its own assessments of these camps, is using the Chinese term "jizhong," which means concentration. So if you think about what the term concentration means when it refers to camps, it's specifically about bringing together people of a certain ethnicity and by force into these facilities, and that's kind of exactly what we've seen here.
Bethany, I'm looking at one of your tweets quite recently, looking at some of the work that you've done, and I'm looking exactly at how you've described this. You called it breaking at the time. They've obtained a new trove of highly classified Chinese government documents, including the operations manual for China's concentration camps. You have no doubt that these are concentration camps from your reporting.
I think the term concentration camps, part of why I use that is because it taps into the people who would be reading that tweet, our readership. It taps into an emotional feeling, an emotional response, and an emotional understanding of what something is. And the reality of these camps is that it is a sweeping government policy aimed at eradicating an ethnic minority. In this case, not necessarily through mass murder, but through changing their identity. And that is what we associate with concentration camps. It's a mass policy aimed at eliminating or harming or controlling an ethnic and religious minority, and that's exactly what this is.
Yeah, just Mega mentioned as well in the titles that China used, for example, they used the Chinese name. If you take the education part out of the Chinese terminology in this name in it, so this is concentration camps. So they say concentrated education camps, they call it. So if you take the education part of it, it becomes the concentration camp in Chinese title itself as well. But as a journalist, we've been listening to experts like Adrian Zenz and human rights activists and everybody who are familiar with the policy. They're calling it concentration camps. But so far, we didn't call it concentration camps ourselves, but we call it internment camps in Radio Free Asia, but other experts are saying because of those reasons that these are concentration camps.
All right.
Mama Jen, I want to pose this to you. This is someone on Twitter, Sharman, who says, how is it that the Chinese government is still denying that these are prisons, despite the overwhelming evidence found through various investigations? What do we know right now that's coming out of the Chinese government, and how has that changed over time?
China, when China started this campaign, it is beginning of 2017. China said, when we had this news, they denied it. They didn't have anything like that. And when UN in 2018 come up with this report that over 1 million people are being held in these camps, and China immediately changed its narrative, saying that, yes, we have some people for training, job training. And so far, China had been pushed to answer and respond to these policies, but China is denying that it's concentration. It's a mass detention of Uyghur, other Turkic Muslims over there. But if China admits that it's a concentration camp or a detention camp, China had to answer and release those people. That's what China is denying. And China knows that it's making a mistake, actually, over there.
So the video that our audience is watching on the screen, this video is from 2019 from education facility that the Chinese government are kind of calling it. We did ask the Chinese government to either take part in this conversation or to send us a statement, and they declined. But we were able to use some comments from the China Global TV Network group, and a particular reporter called Lu Xin, who is well known on the CGTN network, and she characterizes what is happening in China with these education centers, these internment centers, however you decide to call them. She characterizes them in a very different way. Have a listen.
The so-called Uyghur Act of 2019 disregards the efforts as counter-terrorism and calls for measures to counter what it calls arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghurs. This is the same as saying it's wrong to ask someone in the US to do compulsory community service for the minor crimes they committed. Although the Xinjiang remedy, where people not only learn a lesson but something useful, is in nature more similar to Britain's desistance and disengagement program, the country's tailor-made disindoctrination program. Xinjiang is dealing with minor offenders to effectively tackle the root causes of terrorism.
Sounds so reasonable there, Mega, but the comments that we've been getting from outside of China have been horrific things are happening to people. They are being surveilled, and also that they are just being ripped away from their families. Why is the narrative from China so very different from the narrative of people like you who are reporting this story?
Well, I think first we should make clear that CGTN is state media in China. It is an official government mouthpiece. So, of course, it makes sense that a CGTN reporter or other officials from the organization would be defending official government policy. But, you know, to the point that she made about, you know, minor offenses deserving punishment, if the people who, the hundreds of thousands of people who have been sent to these camps have indeed committed minor infractions, what are the infractions? Where was the charge? Where was the arrest? Where was the trial? All of this stuff is happening in a black box, and there's very little transparency that's been provided by the government to kind of show the defense behind any of this stuff. And if the government is really so sure that what it's doing is correct, and then I personally believe that it should stand up to scrutiny by the international community.
Right, and one thing that our leaked documents show is that there's a system called IJOP, which takes mass data collection, analyzes it, and through various algorithms spits out names of people who are suspicious. And so one of the documents that I looked at personally, IJOP put forward 24,000 names of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and within 1 week, police swept up more than 15,000 of them and put them in, as it calls, concentrated education and training. There was no mention of guilt, there was no mention of a trial, of charges, not even of a true police investigation. This was being done through basically some kind of unknown algorithm. It is profoundly different, cannot be even remotely compared to any system of justice that is being implemented in a country with rule of law. So the argument that this is somehow for people who are criminals is a lie.
Exactly. For example, we talked to this local official once, and he said that one lady was sentenced for 8 years after she's been educated because she was advising her brother-in-law not to eat during the month of Ramadan. That's her crime. She was sentenced for 8 years. And I can also give my brothers as an example. For example, I got 3 brothers who had been taken away to the camps. 2 of them 2017 May, and 1 of them February 2018. And so far, one of them were teacher in a very kind of respected high school, and he was nominated for the headmaster of that high school. And he's exemplary teacher. Actually, he speaks 3 different languages. He's a very well-educated person. He never committed any crime in his own whole life. He has one son. And another brother, he graduated from Tranmere Dashi from Beijing. It's a very respected, highly kind of high education college in Beijing. And he had his own company. He didn't commit any crime. Also, he translated many Chinese books. One of the Mo Yan's book, for example, from the Red Sogrum, he translated that book into Uyghur, and he's taken away to the camps. And what's his crime? He didn't commit any crimes, for example. And my other brother, he had also his own business. He studied law in Xinjiang University. He knows what crime means, and he's taken away. So those people, I don't know the exact numbers, but experts are saying that 1.8 million people, this is a new number. Some Uyghurs and activists are saying that 3 million. And 90% of those people could have been just like my brothers, didn't commit any crimes.
3 people and 1 family. Mama Jan, thank you for sharing that story, because I know it can't be easy, especially being a reporter. You have to worry about reprisals. You have to worry about the safety of your family back there. We're hearing that from people online as well who share with us the difficulties they're facing. So this is one person, Najmuddin, who wrote to us on Twitter. He says, Chinese government's unwillingness to allow free media makes it impossible for reporters to do their job when landing in Xinjiang. They are monitored and stopped wherever they go. Uyghurs on the ground are afraid of talking to a foreigner, especially a reporter. Even with that said, he still wanted to share the story of his family. So here's what he told the stream.
I lost contact with my family members back home in Kashgar city since the end of 2015. That time my mother was on the phone crying while she was telling me not to call them again. In order not to put them in further danger, I did not contact them again. But in the year 2018, I learned that my grandfather, Rahman Idris, died in China's government's detention center in Kashgar city. I was mourning for the unlawful detention and the death of my grandfather. I learned in this year, March, that my father also died in China's government's camps, possibly in Kashgar city. Now I ask Chinese government officials, where are my other family members, my mother and my sister and my brothers?
So Mega, of course, we at the stream can't independently verify the accounts around his family members, but you could hear the hurt and the passion in his voice there. So I wanted to direct that to you to talk to us about the repercussions for journalists and, of course, for their sources in that region.
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the most difficult things about reporting on the story is just the penalties for reporting on it and also just the lack of access. When you think about both the camps and this kind of heavy-handed surveillance technology that's deployed against people in the region, it really, really helps to physically be on the ground, to be able to see it and to document it, for the rest of the world to be able to understand, both in text and in photos. But in practice, what happens is that when journalists land in Xinjiang, they're often greeted by police right after they step off the plane, or even when they check into a hotel, at checkpoints, all of these places. And what ends up happening is that you either get detained for so long that you can't go anywhere, or you're followed, which basically sends a message to anybody who might talk to you, who might share their story with you, that there are going to be really serious repercussions for them if they choose to do that. And in fact, there are many stories of sources of journalists who are based in China, as well as people who have collaborated with them, even people like drivers, for instance, and translators who have been sent off to detention just for doing that. So it's a really, really serious situation. It's life or death for a lot of people there, and it's contributed. I think it's really impoverished, all of us as newsreaders and part of the global community that cares about this issue, from actually learning the real truth of the story, because we've been forced to sort of feed off of these dribs and drabs that come out from people who have escaped the region, or from other sources such as document leaks, like Bethany has recently reported, as well as satellite imagery and other things like that.
Mega, if you don't mind, I know journalists hate to be the story, but part of what you've been doing has turned you into the story. So I'm just going to point people to a headline that The Guardian shared. This is a year ago, so I know you haven't been in China for a little while. China ejects US journalist known for reporting on Xinjiang repression. That journalist is you. Bethany, as you're trying to do your stories, what are the biggest challenges for you?
Well, I'm based outside of China anyway, so in some ways, I have from the very beginning always had to face these kinds of restrictions because I'm not in China anyway. However, it has gotten more difficult to speak with people inside of China. It used to be much easier to reach out. Even Uyghur sources in the United States have had to reckon with the choice of, if I speak to a journalist, perhaps my family will be detained or will disappear. So even here in the United States, Uyghur sources and other sources don't feel free, and they don't feel safe, and they have been subject to harassment.
I'm just thinking here, I just want everybody to have a look at this reporting here from Radio Free Asia, because Mamatjan, what you did was you and your colleagues got together to tell your very personal stories about what's been happening to your family. That must be a very difficult thing for you to share your own lives as part of journalism. Do you feel the journalism is leading you, or is it your personal heartache that is pushing you to continue to tell a story?
We could say it's a very thin line that we walk, because the Uyghur service, Radio Free Asia and Uyghur service, is only one Uyghur language service for the Uyghurs around the world. So we got 11-something people, and there are 12 million people back inside China and 1 to 3 million people in the camps. And if you don't do the job, if you don't report on them, so yes, many organizations like you guys and other AP, AFP, Wall Street Journal, everybody's doing it, but we have privilege. I mean, a special way of connecting them. So we know the language, we know the local officials, so we have to do it. If you don't do it, it's not been done enough, because we are the first ones who did report on this mass internment of Uyghurs at the beginning, and then other organizations, media organizations follow through. So it's also personal, as well as it's a calling for us. Yeah.
I just want to show this because I want people to go off and then hear these personal stories again here, Radio Free Asia, and you can see your colleagues and you can see Mamatjan as well, telling their stories about the people and their family and their friends that they don't know where they are, or they know where they are and they can't get to them. Milika.
I wanted to share this from Twitter. This is Abba, who says, exposing the camps without any real sanctions to China will do very little to actually close them. That's echoed on YouTube. So we got a comment from someone saying something very similar. This is Abu Bakr, who writes in, now that this has been exposed, what will the UN do about it? That really matters. But if nothing is done, then the worst is yet to happen. So Bethany, what do you think the results of your reporting, that the China, the cables, it's all come out now. We're seeing tweets about it. We're doing shows about it. What will happen next?
I have been heartened to some extent because, when things started getting really, really bad in Xinjiang, they've been bad for a long time, but say 3 years ago, no one cared. No governments were making statements about this. In the past year and a half, especially in the past year, and especially since the leaks of documents, we have seen more and more governments at least making statements. So, for example, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently called what's happening in Xinjiang the stain of the century. That's an important statement. But let's be clear, that's symbolic. And the U.S. House recently passed the Uyghur Human Rights Act, that if passed into law, would put sanctions on key Chinese government individuals who are complicit in this. That matters. But again, it's symbolic. It will not actually force the Chinese government to do anything. What Western nations who are concerned with human rights have really failed to do is to counter the Chinese government's years-long campaign to weaken international support for human rights, including mechanisms inside the United Nations. To date, the UN Secretary General has not condemned China's detention camps. Isn't that his job? And that's because of the groundwork that China has worked for years to lay in case they needed it for a situation like this.
But of course, not just Western nations. The last show we did on the Uyghurs was looking at Arab countries, Muslim majority countries, yes, who people were saying have not done enough on this issue. So it's not just the West.
No, of course, it's most certainly not. And again, it's the same years-long campaign that China has waged. And when it comes specifically to Muslim majority nations, it's an economic campaign. So many of those nations are now heavily dependent on China for infrastructure investment, for loans, for trade. Iran, for example, heavily dependent on China. So people like to point fingers at them and say, why aren't the Muslim majority countries standing up? Well, it's not a simple question. It has very much to do with China's massive economic might.
Guess I'm looking at this headline here from The Guardian, and this is how we started our show. China claims detained Uyghurs have been freed. Knowing from your contacts, your sources, your reportage, is this true?
So far, it's been a couple of days that Xinjiang Governor Shohrat Zakir claimed that most of the students are graduated, and we don't know what does it mean. But so far, we got thousands of Uyghurs who are living outside of China and who have relatives inside the camps, inside the Chinese education centers. But we didn't have any confirmation. They didn't even come up to say that my relatives are being released.
Right.
So we don't know. So far, we couldn't confirm anything.
Megha, do you think this might be a reaction to the international community and journalists around the world reporting more on what the Uyghurs are going through?
I mean, it's hard to say. I certainly think that it's very clear. Like Mabajan pointed this out, which is that as soon as the UN made a statement in a very, very public way about their concern with the internment camps and the number of people who were being interned, that was the point at which the Chinese government actually acknowledged that this was a thing that was happening, even if they didn't acknowledge the reality of the situation. So I do think that public pressure has played a role, at least up until this point. But as Bethany said, like many of the actions that have been taken so far by international governments, certainly by the UN, by the EU, even in the United States, has been largely symbolic.
Yes, but largely symbolic. But the United States is only one country who's been leading the world to act and say something or just speak up. Mike Pompeo also, just like Bethany mentioned, mentioned they called on China many times, and Mike Pence as well. And recently, one of the biggest star in Muslim world, the football star.
Yes.
Uighurs.
So the stories are getting out there. I know exactly who you mean. Mesut Ozil, who's been tweeting about the Uyghur situation. Malika, where do you leave us?
with Najmuddin, who says, how does China expect the world to believe its claim of graduation if the Uyghurs can't talk to our family members for years? So that is one we'll pose to the government there.
Mamatjan, Bethany, Mega, thank you so much for joining us on the stream today. Luke and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.